Hi there, and welcome to the Anthony Bradley Show. I'm so excited today to have with me Robert Tyminski. And he wrote a fascinating book titled Male Alienation at the Crossroads of Identity, Culture, and Cyberspace. And today's conversation, I've been looking forward to. I found this book a few months ago, and I'm really excited about the opportunity. I just want to introduce him really quickly. Dr. Tyminski is a psychologist and a Jungian analyst in San Francisco. Also teaches in the clinical program of the Department of Psychology at the University of California, San Francisco. He works with adults dealing with issues like relationship turmoil, career change, creative obstacles, work stress, major life transitions. He also sees children and adolescents, as well as their parents, to treat a variety of family, developmental, and adjustment issues. He's published articles in different professional journals on topics about adolescence, addiction, group therapy, social skills development, and dreams. Dr. Tyminski holds a doctoral degree in mental health from the University of California at San Francisco. He has an MBA from the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley, and for 14 years has led a nonprofit organization devoted to treating troubled children and their families. Dr. Tyminski, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, you're more than welcome. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk with you.
Could you just tell us a little bit about how you became interested in adolescence and the troubles that particularly boys have during this period of their life?
Well, I think a lot of it comes out of my experience. You mentioned running this nonprofit, which actually was a school in California. We call them non-public schools, which means that they're publicly funded, but they're usually under the umbrella of a private nonprofit. And after I graduated, when I finished my doctoral training at UCSF, I had done a fair amount of elective work working with children and with teenagers, usually in schools and high schools or middle schools. And so there was a job open at this school, and initially I was hired as the clinical director. And so I went there, and as things often happen in nonprofits, there's a high degree of unpredictability.
Of course.
And about 6 months later, I was promoted to be the executive director. And so that really kind of was not something that I think I would have ever predicted. And it was just one of those experiences where I thought, okay, I'm going to learn as much as I can. Most of the people in the program, so after that first year, were boys. I would say up to 90%, and probably over 80% of them were racial and ethnic minority families. And so it was, it was different for me in that regard. And I had a lot of learning to do at that time. And I just kind of dove in, as much as I could, and talked a lot with families. And, I oversaw the clinical piece to some extent. I didn't treat any of the children or families myself. We had separate staff who did that. But often if there was a problem, I would sit in on some of those meetings, and certainly families often came to me when they had an issue with something happening at the school. So after I finished that, after it was one of those turning points where you sort of like think, okay, what am I going to do next? I often say about the center was called Oaks, and I often say I stayed there for 14 years and probably should have only stayed for 7. I'm a hanger-on in that way, and I decided I would do the Jungian analytic training, and And it was possible, you know, when I was setting up my private practice at that point for me, there aren't a fairly high number, percentage-wise, of men who work with children, and so it's an area where there's some need, and so it just sort of worked out for me that way. So kind of a
Yeah,
long
that's
answer.
right. No, that's fantastic. You know, I've been teaching at the college level now for about 10 years, and before that, I taught high school for 4 years. And as I was reading the book, I was just sort of remembering so many young men that I've encountered who were in serious crisis. And so many of them have never had opportunities to get help, and they actually don't understand some of the dots in their own story that
Yeah.
led to, for many of them, a lot of depression and anxiety, some of their own neuroses, and just a lot of confusion there. And so when I came across this particular text, I was really excited to see the ways in which you connected some of these dots is super helpful. The first phrase in the title is male alienation. Can you tell us what alienation actually is?
Yeah. So alienation is, well, just a little bit about the history of the word. So it actually comes to us from French, and it was used there as a term to designate insanity or mental disturbance. And the way it migrated into English was similar. And so that around the turn of late kind of 19th century, early 20th century, people who treated or worked in asylums and treated the mentally ill were called alienists. And the idea was is that you know, very interesting. And of course we don't call ourselves that anymore, but I think something about like a kind of a gap, severing of some connection, some important connection. And so alienation, there are two gaps, I think, that get created. And one is the more visible, obvious one, which is external, where a person isolates and will withdraw. And so that kind of alienation is apparent to us as a behavior. But the kind that I really try and speak to in the book, and that I'm telling you a little about the history of the word, is the inner alienation. So something about a loss of connection with oneself, and a feeling that you're really not at home in your own inner world, that there's something there that just can't kind of be at peace, or that you can't really sort of dive into without great distress. So there are those two pieces to it.
Yeah, and as I was reading the book and thinking about my own story, I just remember how tumultuous middle school and high school were for me, right? Trying to sort all these things out. And this may be an obvious question, but can you really help us understand why it is that maybe puberty, adolescence is such a difficult time with respect to the issue of alienation? Why
Yeah.
is it that those years tend to be such a hard time at kind of understanding the inner life, particularly for boys?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question, and I could probably talk with you the rest of the time just about that. But I think there are a lot of things that happen. You know, it's a transition time. It's exciting. There are obvious physical changes that a boy undergoes. I mentioned in the book that that testosterone levels go up 30-fold, which is that's a big jump, right? For anything to increase that much. And so I think there's a lot of excitement about the growth and about thinking about the future and what it will be like to be a young man. But it is a transition period. And during that transition, I think a lot of boys are finding their ways. And you know, where things are good enough for most of us, it goes fine, right? We just muddle through, and we take our kind of falls and bruises and develop a thicker skin, and we move on. But it is a trying and a testing time. And I think what happens that for boys that can make it particularly problematic is if there's a parental withdrawal, and either the father or the mother at that time, or both. And often, especially nowadays, I think parents feel so worn down, especially during the pandemic and everything, with all the running a school at home while they're also working. And but there is generally a sense of like, okay, there's going to be a lot more behavioral challenges that are natural to that period. And sometimes parents don't like that. And the sweet boy or sweet girl that they had is now a little bit like a monster. It's the Jekyll and Hyde thing. And so sometimes parents withdraw on their side because they're tired or they're frustrated, or maybe that period in their own lives was problematic. So there's that piece to it, which I would say is the most immediate one. But then also the boys are casting about and they're looking for some answer to the question, how am I supposed to be? How am I supposed to look? How am I supposed to appear? And it's really interesting to think about these male ideologies that circulate and seem to have a life of their own. I mean, I think, I don't think there's any part of the country that's isolated from this or does it differently. But there are these ways in which, boys can get carried away with a kind of masculine ideology that sometimes is toxic. Oftentimes is not toxic, but just very annoying. That doesn't really make a lot of room for what goes on inside. And there tends to be a dichotomization that occurs because what goes on inside sometimes is like conceived as being feminine. Or feminizing. And that's extremely unfortunate. And, again, for most of us, we get through that and we realize that isn't the case. But I think for boys, there's a way in which one kid, I think I might mention him in the book. He was describing to me, he was 14, a problem with his girlfriend. And I said, well, what if you put yourself in her shoes, And he looked at me like I was totally nuts. And he said, ooh, dude, who would want to do that? And so just even the idea of trying to, get a little more internal in that way, this was a perfectly, in many ways, nice kid, but he had picked that up as something about what it means to be a kind of a boy teenager at that phase of life, that looking inside is a bit of a dicey proposition.
Right. And to make matters worse, in 2020 versus, say, 1820, there's some additional opportunities, I think, for boys to get the messaging wrong and maybe confusing. And the internet just provides, you think about Instagram and TikTok and Snapchat and YouTube and all these shows that don't help with the sorting of the questions that you pose. And I'm wondering, how is the internet not the best place, or how can the internet, cyberspace, sort of complicate these issues for boys in particular?
Yeah, well, you just mentioned those social media platforms, and the one thing I would throw in there is video gaming too, because especially for a lot of boys, that's where their social media piece occurs. They're chatting, or they're on Discord or something, or they're on a mic and they're chatting with one another while they're playing the game. I think it starts out innocently enough, because I think one thing that kids in general, but without trying to be too binary here, might be slightly more true for boys, is something about like looking for an adventure. And so they often go on the internet thinking, oh, this is going to be a big adventure. I'm going to find something that nobody knows about, or that only a few people know about, and I'll be in this special in group, something like that. And then often, they end up kind of going down the rabbit hole. And this happens a lot because, especially on a platform like YouTube, I think they've modified the algorithm or whatever it's called from public pressure from parents and parents groups and children right groups. But they had this intensification. So I've heard a version of this story many times where a boy, 13, 14, 15, is interested in conservative politics. So he'll go on YouTube and listen to, some conservative politician. And then the algorithm will suggest, like, okay, you've listened to 20 hours with this guy. How about, and then it'll pop up somebody who's a little bit more extreme. And so then they'll listen to that person. And then before they know it, they're in the alt-right, neo-Nazi white supremacist universe. And that's where they get into trouble. That's where they get into big trouble. And the adventure has clearly overtaken them. And so that part of it about using the internet for adventure, I think there's actually something good to that. But I so wish that there was also like a sense of like not valuing just that, but like the adventures in the real world. Like, you go to a camp for a couple of weeks in the summer and you see what happens, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so it seems that perhaps boys that are maybe more vulnerable to this don't have any other opportunities for adventure, right? Don't have any other opportunities to sort of have those questions answered, to sort of deal with alienation and the inner life. And here comes the internet with all of these portals that you can enter into. And the next thing you know, an hour later, 2 hours later, 2 weeks later, 6 months later, you're in a little tribe, right? And you get a dopamine hit from all that engagement, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. I think there isn't the perspective about what's happening and as it is happening. And that actually is a cognitive thing that kind of develops through adolescence anyways. And so, again, that's where parental kind of like conversations can be helpful. Like, what were you watching there for 5 hours? And can we look at what you looked at last together for a few minutes? And, just trying to sort of understand a little bit like what's he really interested in there. The other thing I'll say about the attraction of the internet, and again, I don't think this is entirely a bad thing. I just think it's somewhat misplaced. But Jungians have this idea of numinosity, that there are experiences in life. I saw you have a background in religious studies and are a theologian, so you probably know this actually maybe better than I do. But the idea of numinosity, that there are things bigger than ourselves that somehow are awe-inspiring and that we can't explain. And they tap into the spiritual dimension of who we are. And I'm not saying that kids are doing this because they're not going to church. Don't get me wrong. But I think there is something about a kind of, it's very unconscious, but a very unconscious pull about that piece of human experience that the internet with these glowing screens and the magic of you press a button and, same day the thing is at your door, or you can create a fake identity and see how that goes. All these things are kind of like tinkering a little bit in what I would call that numinous territory of human experience. And again, I'm not trying to pathologize it. It's just like, does it really belong there? Are you really going to find it there?
Yeah, that is so perceptive. I think what I've found in my own work is that adolescent boys, I think as a lot of men are in general, are just drawn to these larger narratives. They want to be part of a larger story. We're drawn to these, we love action movies and thrillers and heroes and things like that. And I think in modern life, especially sort of suburban, sort of normal middle class life, that part of life just isn't really there. It has to be manufactured, unlike in sort of tribal ancestral cultures where you actually have to go fight the enemy or there's something impending real danger. There's a need for the hero. And so it's interesting because what I find is there's this desire to connect to this narrative, right? There's a desire to connect with the story, and there's a desire to connect with other guys also kind of drawn to this larger narrative, this larger story, this big mission that draws them out. It's sort of transcendent, but there's not real connection, right? Mm-hmm. There's this sort of the perception of connection. And you mentioned it in the book about dark zones, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what that is. You sort of talk about the illusion of companionship and connection and power and control, and some of these platforms, especially video games, I think give adolescent boys a sense of that, but it's not really real, right? So how do these dark zones work, and how does a boy end up in there?
Yeah, well, again, I think that's a very interesting question, because as you were just kind of preparing me there a little, I realized like it's also another piece of like human experience, which is we all have, again, Jungians use this term, the shadow, and so we all have something about us that has to do with, kind of these parts of ourselves that make us squirm, or that we wish weren't there, or that we wish could be very different. And, again, for most of us, we repress it or we compartmentalize. Somehow it's not an issue, but it is a part of us. And I think this kind of experience of like, what is our darkness? What is my darkness? That there's something about that these dark zones. In the case I think I was referring to, where I used that term, those two boys, I mean, they were specifically, one of them was searching the dark web. So that's kind of, and he actually, I said, well, I didn't understand this at the time. So this was several years ago. I said, what is the dark web? And he like looked at me like I was nuts. But he explained it to me, and he said, this is where there are these really shady, dark zones, and where people can, buy guns and drugs and much worse stuff. And so then he started to educate me about some of the other dark zones on the internet. And one of these places are these image boards. So the two that you might have heard of, because they're just vulgar, disgusting things, but they're often in the news, are 4chan and 8chan. And again, 4chan started out innocently enough as a anime and manga site. So for aficionados of Japanese cartoon, and it's cartoon in the big C cartoon sense, animation. But what they've evolved into are these hateful, racist, misogynistic boards where people can post, just the most repulsive stuff. And the message somehow, at least in my understanding, and it may be different now, but it used to be the idea the message would disappear after your post was up for minutes or 30 minutes or something like that. So it kind of gave this sense of like you could say the most outrageous, awful thing you wanted. It was like giving permission for, really that. And I was teaching a class at our institute, our Young Institute in San Francisco last year, and these were all adult, well-trained adult therapists, probably with an average of 25 years experience, but many of them worked with adolescents. And so I asked them if any of them had heard about 4chan or 8chan, and they said no. And I said, well, how about, we had a computer thing and a projector, so I could say, if I have your permission, I said, you're not going to like what you see, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but would you like to see at least a page of what this looks like? Because this is what a lot of boys are looking at. And they said, yes. Well, everybody's jaw was just like, and I didn't click on, they were just seeing the subject lines. I didn't click on any of the posts because I didn't want to go that far. And so that kind of darkness, I think, we all explore that in our adolescence. We all look for, like, you mentioned horror films and, the attraction for those certain kinds of things that we all kind of look as a piece of, like, growing up, but it really has to do with something internal to us about our own unconscious and an awareness of, like, oh, that's a part of us too. But when kids are doing this, they have no awareness of that.
Yeah, and it really makes me concerned in this COVID environment with as much disconnection and isolation, where you have adolescent boys spending so much time alone in their bedrooms, where they would have been at school for the 6, 7, 8 hours a day. Now they're at home. They might do 3, 4 hours of work, and then they're just there. Their parents are working. There may be chaos, and this may be, for many of them, a way to escape the chaos and sort of get some order. And it ends up being a really, really, really dark place. And I think it's also important to note, I think this is especially important for parents, those who work with adolescents. Boys are different, right? Many of them don't have, not all, but most really struggle with putting words to their emotions, right? Can you explain to us what's going on in a boy's life that he can't put the English language to his feelings, and why that's such a struggle?
Yeah, well, that's, again, great question. There's actually a funny term for it. It's called normative male alexithymia, which is a highfalutin way, that would be my grandmother talk, and a highfalutin way of saying that boys don't like to communicate or can't communicate very well about what's happening inside themselves. So the alexithymia is about reading your inner emotional states and then being able to not only make sense out of them, but say something about them. And so a lot of researchers into this sort of particular area have looked at, like, there's always been this sense of, like, when you talk about maturity levels, particularly for emotional and social maturity, a 15-year-old girl and a 15-year-old boy, typically, we're just talking pick one out of a crowd, are going to be operating kind of in very different ways. And some of it has to do with that emotional vocabulary. Now, some boys just don't have the emotional vocabulary. And so, when they show up, like in my office or in anybody's office who's going to be working with them, one of the tasks is, like, helping them to realize, like, what is an emotion? What is a feeling? How do you recognize it? What makes this different from that one? And helping them then to be basically kind of have the building blocks to describe different emotional states. So that's one sort of, and that kind of problem is very remediable, right? Because it's basically like you need to kind of spend a little bit of time thinking about what's going on and coming up with words for it. A different problem are the boys who just can't access what's inside them. And when I teach about this, I use these different slides of houses, you know. And so for this kind of boy, it's a boarded up house, like, you know, that looks like nobody has gone inside it in probably 10 years. And so that's a bit of a different problem, because you have to think about, like, why does he need that much protection? What's going on that makes this so dangerous? And you have to be extremely careful, because there's a reason that place is boarded up, and you don't want to go barging in. So that's a different category of problem for being able to talk about what's inside, if you're saying no, nobody's going there at all. And then the third group would be what I would say is much more boys who so they can get inside and they have the words and they could communicate the words, they just don't want to. And so that's a motivational issue. And often that goes back to what I was saying a little bit ago about, like, yeah, if I start talking that way, I'm going to sound like a girl, or people will think I'm gay, or it just gets into this territory of, like, if you talk about your feelings, how is it going to look to others? And so that's actually, again, a relatively remediable situation to work with, because the boy has the basic tools. It's just there's something about social perceptions and self-image that are clouded.
And tell me what you think of this thesis, that a lot of boys, a lot of teenage guys, maybe even in their early to mid 20s, are free to do that with these sort of anonymous personalities on various platforms on the internet, right? So they don't have to worry about those associations if you know, screen head 2, and I can share things. And there's all these online communities where, and even during video gaming, right? They'll sort of be talking to each other, but they won't really give their true identity. So there's some freedom there. And so my speculation, correct me if I'm wrong, but is that some guys, particularly adolescents, sort of run to the internet so that they can be anonymous, just to have a place to work some of those emotions out.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's exactly right, because it gives them permission under a cloak, right? So if they have the disguise, and then they feel like they're, in a way, they have a greater degree of freedom to say what otherwise they might not communicate. The other thing that does too is it often will link them up with like-minded boys or young men. And that amplifies. So that's the echo chamber effect of these kind of isolated groupings on the internet. I was reading, this is a little bit of a sidebar, but one of these communities are the incels, right? The guys who think that they're involuntarily celibate because of feminism. I mean, I'm simplifying here for sake of time. And I was reading today, I think it's in today's New York Times, this rather long article about how a particular subgroup of this incel community has adopted these two British orthodontists. So they do like braces and constructive surgery and that sort of thing, who have this kooky theory that there's a way in which our faces look different because of the way we eat and the way we were raised. But for this incel community, what the author of the article was saying is that they like this theory because it explains why they're unattractive. And I was just like, wow, if you really are going to go that far, that's saying something.
Yeah, so, it speaks so much for the desire, for acceptance and connection and things like this. And even if guys think it's not entirely masculine, to express that as a real need, right? And to also, I think, express feelings of hurt with respect to rejection and the inability to connect. I'm as an African American man, I've been most of my professional career as a minority in sort of predominantly white spaces, and I wonder. You introduced earlier by saying that you did some work primarily with minority students, and there's a sense in which I believe there's an additional layer of alienation, or at least feelings of alienation, when you're a minority in a predominantly white, either affluent or just sort of a subculture. Have you found that to be an additional burden that complicates this, or is it minor?
Oh, no, I think it's huge. I mean, we live in a racist society, a racist country. I think it's huge. It's not just what would be the right word? Like it's not just a minor stressor. It's almost like a major infection that we have socially and individually, and I think lack of recognition around that, and a lack of wanting to talk about how it feels and what it means and what gets misunderstood. That's a whole extra layer, like you said, of experience that most white people don't have to deal with, that they just take it for granted. I was listening to Kamala Harris last night, and I think she said, one of the things that she said that really stayed with me is, there's no vaccine against racism. And again, you just think about like privilege and entitlement, and you think about healthcare and all these things, and you think like, yeah, somebody will take care of it, it'll be fine. But I think for our communities of color, that's not a base assumption that things are going to be just fine, and so that's a huge problem.
Yeah, so it seems that if you're working with boys, young men who are minorities, I think there needs to be some extra attention paid to this additional layer of alienation, and providing support and really intentionality to potentially address it and allow them to have some space to speak about it. I was really fascinated as a theologian. I'm broadly fascinated by the Jungian school in general. But in the book, you sort of bring in the book of Revelation and the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, which is even for people within the context of the church, it's just a scary part of the book. They don't want to talk about that. It's just a monster. They're coming to punish, and they're mean. And one of the things that I've learned in my own reading is that boys often externalize their pain. And as you mentioned in the book, it can sort of turn them into these difficult figures, sort of monsters. There's this kind of deep, sort of dark part of us. What I'd like to do now is sort of go through these four horsemen and just give us a short description of each of those, and maybe an example of what it looks like in real life when you see guys who are externalizing some of these issues. The first one we talked about is the red horse. What is that?
So the red horse carries a sword. The rider carries a sword, and I think by red they mean the color was like chestnut, and so that, to me, that that particular image. So I think this apocalyptic imagery is very prevalent. So let me just start giving that as a statement. In a lot of these video games, they're set either in apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic, I can't even say it, settings. But like you see it in a lot of the horror genre, the popularity of The Walking Dead, the zombie films. So it's something that's been around for a while. So I don't think it's just a completely random sort of thing that I settled on. But the red horse would be particularly this idea of using that sword in an aggressive way. So these are the guys who act out, and where they act out in a way that there's a real risk of violence. And so in the book, I think I give an example of one of the mass shooters. I picked an example in Germany just because we have so many of them in the U.S. that I was thinking like, well, this is a way to at least show that it's not just the U.S. And he was obsessed with a couple of video games that he had gotten banned from because his behavior was so bad. And so that you know, that kind of aggression, that really, I think, again, if you look at the statistics, is so much, I mean, phenomenally higher among boys and young men than among girls and young women. That seems to be part of our male, you know, dilemma. And so the risk of real violence is huge. I gave an example in a talk that I gave last year in Vienna, and this boy was becoming more and more isolated, and he was he himself had been bullied, but he wanted revenge. And so what he did is he went on the dark web and he started researching what he would have to do to get a gun, and to buy the gun, to get I'm not even sure, like he had some scheme like for an address so it wouldn't come to the house. And luckily his father, during a computer upgrade, unearthed, the father was in IT, and the father unearthed the search history. So that's where, you know, you're like at a tipping point. And so that red horse, I think, is something about that, you know, kind of bloodthirstiness.
Great. What's the white horse?
The white horse, so that rider wears a crown and carries a bow and arrow, and is interpreted, you know, to mean conquest. And so, but I think the tricky thing about the white horse is that it also is something about a kind of up and down. So it's about conquest, but then what happens after the conquest. And I think that's that up-down cycle, inflation, deflation, mania, emptiness. That's what you see in a lot of addictions and compulsions. And so when boys and young men get really into something and they can't stop themselves, and it could be drugs, could be alcohol, could be video games, could be social media, you know, for that matter, being able to limit themselves and stop themselves, that seems to me to be a factor of that up and down cycle, that they're trying to manage some sort of emotional pain in a way that just isn't working.
Very good. How about the black horse?
The black horse that rider carries a set of scales. And so, again, you might know biblically, I think that was associated with famine, right? Like that somehow the scales would weigh the grain. And so I think psychologically, if you think about famine, you think about deprivation. And these are often guys who, you know, sometimes come, I'm not talking about physical deprivation or resource deprivation, but emotional deprivation, and often have backgrounds where there's a kind of coldness or rejection in the family. And what happens is when that's too much, there isn't something to compensate for that, you get an empathy deficit. So these guys often have tremendous empathy deficits, but they're also quite greedy, and which makes some sense because they're trying to make up for what they feel like they never got. And so that greediness can be very, very problematic as well.
Yeah, and when there's an empathy deficit plus greed, that can really turn into something dangerous, right?
Very, very dangerous. Yeah, I was reading a review of Mary Trump's book, of course, and she trained as a clinical psychologist. And so it's very interesting to, hear some of her perceptions about her uncle. And, you can kind of see some of this there, that there was a problem in the family, something emotionally depriving, and this kind of massive greed that's insatiable, and it's not just greed for money, but for attention. So,
Absolutely. One of the projects I'm working on, I'm writing a book on why boys join fraternities. And if you think about, at least in my own work, some of the sort of stereotypes of frat culture, to bring an 18, 19-year-old with an empathy deficit and greed, plus alcohol, right?
yeah,
Right? Plus no supervision, plus women. I mean, it's a toxic cocktail that I think that often leads to a lot of, I think, not only self-harm, but also harming others. That
yeah.
empathy deficit really is quite alarming. How about the pale horse?
So the pale horse is again like that's one that rider sometimes carries a scythe and is followed by Hades or some representative of hell, and so that's really about like death. And I think the pale horse shows up, I think, when you get and I've had this happen in my practice, and certainly it's not totally uncommon when you work with adolescents nowadays, self-harming behaviors. So cutting, which is more typical of girls and young women, but actually does show up in boys and young men as well. And then these kind of accidents that aren't really accidents. So where recklessness leads to, car accidents, or climbing and falling from a great height. I've had that happen in my practice. I hear a lot about skateboard accidents, and so this is where like there's really something despairing that is feeling like there isn't a future. And I think that pale horse is like cutting off the future. And certainly I think in the biblical interpretation that's like you're kind of being basically shepherded towards hell, so there's no redemption there. And so I think that's a very, very concerning presentation.
Yeah, would this particular presentation make an adolescent more vulnerable to suicidal ideation?
Absolutely,
Necessarily?
absolutely. Yeah. The example I give in the book is I mean it's from years ago, when I was hadn't finished my training, and just the guy, he was a young man, but just out of adolescence age wise, and really, really awful, two awful suicide attempts, and within a year. And so, definitely you think about like that kind of despair, and really a sense of what's the point. So,
Yeah, I've been fascinated in some of the reading that I did over the summer, that parents have an amazing opportunity to prevent alienation. I think they have an opportunity to really speak into their children's lives and provide them the emotional space that they need to grow and thrive and have agency. I'm particularly interested in the role of a father. What I find is that a lot of dads don't know how important they are, and they don't really know how much their sons need them. Can you just sort of, if you were sort of talking to a room full of dads who have adolescent boys, sort of grades 6 to 12, what would you tell them about why they're so important and what they can do and why they're needed now, or why they're so important in their
Yeah.
son's life?
Well, I think you just said something that I would probably want to start with, which would be, why would they think they're not needed? You know, that's actually a very sad thought, you know, um, so I think I might start with something about like canvassing the room about like, how many of you believe that? How many of you think you're not necessary or needed for your, you know, 12, 14, 16-year-old son? And you know, I think that sometimes what happens is that often you know, fathers sometimes get frustrated with the rambunctiousness of this period and the testing, the rebelliousness, and the need, the real important need for limits. And I'm not meaning that necessarily just in a disciplinarian kind of way, but like, you know, being able to know when to stop, when enough is enough. And that's, you know, moms do that. I'm not trying to say they don't, but dads need to be involved in that too, and particularly with their sons. The idea of the adventure that I mentioned earlier too, I think, like, you know, like adolescence is an adventure. I mean, any part of childhood really. And so like, why wouldn't the dad want to be part of that? Like to create, you know, your own adventure with your son in some way. And maybe it's a yearly fishing trip. Maybe it's a, you know, a yearly, you know, it could be something that, it doesn't have to be something that's like that complicated, but that's something that repeats and that has a little bit of the two of you are, you know, going off on your own, and you're gonna, you know, spend a week at the farm or whatever it's gonna be. And that creates stories. And those stories are so vital to all of us. But you think about like alienation. Part of alienation is not knowing where a story is, like not even being able to locate the story. And so, you know, my father used to drag me to a farm. His parents had a farm in upstate New York, and he used to drag me there weekly, and in the summer sometimes for a whole week. And I'm sure I was mouthy and I protested, but when I look back, I am so glad he did that and so thankful to him, because I have so many stories about that time on the farm. So that's the kind of thing. And the other thing I guess I would say is that numinous piece that I mentioned earlier too. Fathers can help with that. And I don't mean like, oh, you have to take your kid to church kind of thing, but you can talk about like, what do things mean? You know, like, what do you think? You know, have some of those big conversations. Don't shy away from those big conversations about who do you want to be, and how do you make meaning out of things, and what do you do when it seems like there isn't meaning. Those are so important.
Yeah, I think sometimes some parents feel ill-equipped or unable to connect with their own children that way, and they feel like, well, I you know, he's not talking, right? He should have shut down. I don't know how to deal with it. And I would just want to say, well, just engage, right? Spend time, right? It takes time, right? I think you mentioned this in the book, that the boys often open up in the context of time spent together, right? So it's not just sort of 10 minutes. It might be a road trip where 3 hours into the trip, or maybe on day 2, the kid finally opens up, right?
Yep. Well, that's so funny you say that because yeah, as you were saying it, I was also thinking about a dad that I was trying to get to spend more time with his son, who was doing those kinds of things, like not talking to him, or that kind of one word shrugs, that sort of thing. And I said to the dad, I said, well, is there ever any point that you can think of where he does talk more with you? So he thought about it and he said, well, it's funny. He talks to me when he's in the car, and like when I'm driving him places, or when, we're going to pick up takeout and something like that. So I actually said, why don't you go on a road trip, the two of you? And he came back, and it was so funny that the first thing that dad said to me is, he wouldn't shut up. He was just a chatterbox. So you have to meet them where they're at. But I think what you're saying is really significant too, that it requires effort.
Right. This is really, really fantastic. I really want those that work with teens and adolescents and young men to have, especially their parents, they really have permission to engage. And I'm wondering, as we wrap up, there may be people who listen to this and now they're worried about their son. How should they get help if they have, or rather, two things. One, what should they be looking for? What are some of the signs and symptoms of alienation? And then lastly, if they have concerns, how should they go about getting help?
Well, the main, kind of behavior, well, there are two behavioral things that I would say. One is that withdrawal. And so if you're really getting a sense that your boy is withdrawing from you, and like your attempts to reach him are not going anywhere, that is cause for concern. And then coupled with that, the second thing are like, I'm not quite sure how to put it, but like random changes of behavior coupled with the withdrawal. So like if all of a sudden he seems unusually silly, or all of a sudden he seems high, or drunk, or kind of like that, that's often that vacillation. That's the behavior trying to communicate something. And so parents would have to be attentive, and then, like realize, okay, this is a message. It's encoded. It's encoded in the behavior, and the parents' duty then is to try and just be aware of it. They don't have to do the decoding, but say, hey, look, something's not right here. We need to get some help. And as to where to turn to, I mean, there are lots of local, most states and cities, but even for people who are in more rural or small town settings, there are local professional organizations, sometimes at the county level. And those are good resources. I mean, those are good places to turn to. You can often get a referral for a therapist from them. They often, will know who works more specifically with adolescents and young adults. And so that's probably the best place. I was going to say there's also health plans, but my experience with people, at least in California, turning to the health plans is I don't want to say exactly miserable, but it's not as, they have a duty to provide referrals. And often what they'll do is email a list with 100 therapists. And the parent just doesn't know what to do with that list then. So I think your local professional organizations online, sometimes Googling, like, therapist for boys near me, that kind of thing. There are a lot of online resources now too, and a lot of, the big major mental health organizations have an online presence.
This is really, really fascinating. Dr. Robert Tyminski, the author of Male Alienation at the Crossroads of Identity, Culture, and Cyberspace. If you work with adolescents in any capacity, I would highly recommend this book. It will open up so much about their world and provide some opportunities to have some real effective interventions. I learned so much from this. So thank you. Thank you so much for explaining this to us. And I'm going to do everything I can to get as many people to get this book in their hands as possible. Robert Tyminski, thank you very much.
Thank you. I really appreciated talking with you.